Welcome to True Crime World. Was March 1st, 2000 in Aberdeen, Australia. A normally peaceful and quiet town, unfamiliar with crime, and certainly not accustomed to particularly brutal ones. But on this day, as two children were sent away to stay at a friend's house for the night, the most savage of crimes would take place. And in all of Australia, no crime before it, nor any crime after it, would compare. Welcome back to World True Crime Today. We'll be covering one of Australia's most notorious female killers, and the only one to be serving a life sentence without possibility of parole, along with an unprecedented special instruction on her file, due to the extremely heinous nature of her crime. We want to warn you that this video covers graphic accounts, cannibalism, dismemberment, and other gruesome acts. If you're not comfortable with those topics, we recommend skipping this particular case and tuning in to one of our other cases instead. Barbara Ruffin and Jack Ruffin lived a relatively simple life in the small town of Aberdeen, Australia. During their marriage, Barbara and Jack gave birth to 4 sons. At some point after their 4th son was born, Barbara began having an affair with a co-worker of Jack's named Ken Knight. Once people around town became aware of the affair, Barbara and Ken began facing significant backlash and eventually decided to move away from Aberdeen to marry. Barbara and Jack's 2 older sons remained behind with Jack while the 2 younger ones were sent off to live with Anat Ruffin. While Barbara and Ken did not marry, they would go on to have 4 additional children together, including twin girls who were born on October 24, 1955, one of which was Katherine Mary, in 1959 when Katherine was 4 years old. Ruffin passed away and the 2 older sons that were living with him came to live with Barbara, Ken, and the rest of the children. And then in 1969 the family moved back to Aberdeen. By this time it was clear that Ken was an abusive alcoholic who would rape Barbara up to 10 times per day, and Barbara also played a large role in the dysfunctionality of the family dynamic, often sharing with Katherine and later future daughters the intimate details of her sex life and how she loathed both sex and men. Once Katherine became older and began engaging in sexual activities with her own partners, she complained to her mother that one of her partners wanted her to participate in acts. She was not comfortable with her mother's response, was to put up with it and stop complaining. Katherine would also later share that she was sexually assaulted by numerous family members up until she was 11 years old. Some accounts of Katherine's demeanor as a child were reported as both loving and kind, while others, including many of her classmates from Muswellbrook High School, remember Katherine as a loner and a bully. On one occasion, she assaulted a male classmate, and on another a teacher injured her while acting in self-defense. When Katherine was not acting out is when she was considered to be a model student and even earned awards for her good behavior. When she left school at age 15, Katherine could neither read nor write, and given that there was a meat factory or slaughterhouse in every location her family had lived, it was not surprising that she aspired to work at such a place. Someday when she grew up, but the first job she landed after leaving school was as a cutter at a local clothing factory. She worked there for a year before landing to what she called her dream job, cutting the internal organs of animals at a local slaughterhouse alongside her father, twin sister Joy, and brother Charlie. There she was soon promoted to a position deboning meat and was given her own set of butcher knives, which she hung over her bed so that they'd always be handy if she needed them. She claimed she would hang these knives above her bed at every home she would subsequently live in. In 1973, Katherine met 22-year-old David Callett, a co-worker at the slaughterhouse. David drank heavily, brought on by 2 traumatic events in his life, his best friend being killed in front of him and participating in the rescue attempt, children whose boss was struck by a train, 6 of whom were killed. Within a year of meeting, David and Katherine got married, with the couple arriving to the wedding service on Katherine's motorcycle, with David heavily intoxicated. The moment they arrived, Katherine's mother gave David some advice. "You better watch this one, or she'll kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing, and you're out. Don't ever think of cheating on her. Show up and she will kill you." And that didn't take long on their wedding night. Katherine tried to strangle David, She would later explain that it was because he fell asleep after only having intercourse with her 3 times, and the violence only progressed from there. When Katherine was heavily pregnant, she burned all of David's clothes and shoes before proceeding to strike him in the head with a frying pan. The offense that triggered the violence was that he arrived home late from a darts competition because he'd made it to the finals. Worried he was about to die, David escaped their home heading for a neighbor's where he collapsed with a severely fractured skull. Police wanted David to press charges against Katherine, but Katherine talked David into dropping all charges. In 1976, shortly after the birth of their first child, Melissa, and fed up with the 3 years of abuse he'd endured from Katherine, David left Katherine for another woman and moved to Queensland. Katherine was devastated by the departure, and her behavior became even more erratic than normal, landing her in the hospital, where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression. Spent several weeks in recovery there. Once released, she promptly packed up her newborn, took her to the railway just before the train was due to arrive, and she placed her on the track. She then headed downtown with an axe, threatening to kill several people along the way. Back at the train station, a homeless gentleman rescued 2-month-old Melissa just minutes before the train would have arrived. Katherine was hospitalized again but checked herself out the following day. And of course, there was no break in her deviant behavior within a few days. Katherine slashed a woman's face with one of her beloved knives and demanded that the woman drive her to Queensland to find David. However, once they reached a gas station, the woman escaped, and Katherine threatened to take the life of a young boy that she had since taken hostage. Police arrived, disarmed her, and had her admitted to a different psychiatric hospital. There, Katherine admitted to nurses that she planned to kill the mechanic at the gas station, since he was the one who ever repaired David's car, allowing him to leave her. She said she then planned to kill David and his mother once she arrived in Queensland. When police informed David of the incident, he left his girlfriend and returned to live in Aberdeen with his mother so that he could support Katherine in her time of need. Once Katherine was released, the subsequent time she and David moved to Ipswich, where Katherine landed another slaughterhouse job, Dinmore Meatwork. Years later, they welcomed another daughter, Natasha, and 4 years after that, in 1984, Katherine left David. Katherine's next major relationship began 2 years later in 1986, when she met another David Saunders, a 38-year-old local miner. Within a few months, Katherine and her daughters would move from the government-provided housing she was living in at the time to live with Saunders. The relationship was tumultuous, with Katherine constantly suspicious of Saunders' actions, resulting in her regularly throwing him out of his own home and even cutting the throat of his 2-month-old puppy right in front of him. She told him that was an example of what would happen to him if he ever cheated on her, that she'd done to David Kellett before him. She knocked him unconscious with a frying pan. Despite the violence and sheer brutality of the relationship, Katherine went on to have a child with Saunders' daughter named Sarah. Saunders' final breaking point came after a particularly violent fight where Katherine struck Saunders in the face with a clothing iron, then stabbed him in the abdomen with scissors. He moved out and went into hiding. When he tried to return to see his daughter several months later, he found that Katherine had lied to the police, claiming she was fearful of him in order to get a restraining order against him. Katherine would go on to date and have one more son by another partner before meeting John Price. John Price, known as Pricey to those close to him, was a divorced father of 3 when he and Katherine met. John's 2 oldest children lived with him while the youngest lived with their mother. Friends and family of John describe him as a terrific man that was liked by everyone who knew him. John was fully aware of Katherine's violent history, but in 1995, he still allowed her to move into the 3-bedroom brick bungalow he owned with him and his children, who had developed a fondness for her. In 1998, Katherine and John got into a fight over his refusal to marry her. After, and fumed over the fight, she decided to videotape an item John supposedly stolen from work, then sent the video to his boss at work. Even though the item he'd taken was an outdated medical kit that he'd retrieved from the trash bin, they were still forced to fire him after 17 years of service to the company. John promptly kicked Katherine out of the house, but after a few months had passed, despite his friends pleading to stay as far away as he could from such a dangerous and devious woman, John took Katherine back, but he was more cautious and didn't allow her to move into his home this time. The couple continued to fight even more regularly than before. In John's, friends, disgusted that he returned to such misery, in danger, no longer wanted anything to do with either of them. By the end of February 2000, Rice had finally had enough of Katherine and her abuse. After several terrifying incidents where he was justifiably fearful she was going to kill him, including an incident where he woke to her standing at the foot of his bed with what he feared was a knife behind her back, John cut their relationship off and secured a restraining order against her, which forbid her from coming near him or his children. Once that was secured, as she'd done several times in the past, he let his friends and co-workers know that if he were to not come to work the next day, it would be because Katherine had murdered him. His co-workers pleaded with him to not return home, but John, fearful for his children's lives, felt they had no choice if he were going to protect his children. When John arrived home that night, his children were not home. Apparently Katherine had come by and sent them away to stay at a friend's house for the night. Katherine was not at this home either. John decided to stay away from the house as long as he could, staying at a neighbor's home for most of the evening, then returning home about 11 p.m. At some point after John had fallen asleep, Katherine arrived at this home and awoke him to have sex. John fell asleep afterward. The next morning, March 1st, a neighbor was surprised to still see John's car in his driveway, since he'd usually left for work by that point. And since John was never late for work, his co-workers were concerned that he hadn't arrived at work by a certain time. As well, soon of them went to his home to check on him together. The neighbor and the concerned co-worker tried to wake John by knocking on his bedroom window. At some point during their attempts, they noticed blood on the front door and called police. Arrived and broke down the back door to gain entry into the home, and what they saw from that point left the officers so traumatized that they still struggled to this day to cope with what they saw upon entry. Police first came across John's skin hanging from a hook in the doorway arch of the lounger room, not recognizing the dangling obstacle amidst the dim light and figuring it was some sort of drapery. One of the officers brushed it aside. She passed, only to have his arm covered in blood from just grazing it. Later autopsy results would show that, drawing on her years of experience chairing animals, Katherine had used medical precision to meticulously slice John's corpse, then carefully pull his skin from his flesh from the tip of his head to the bottom of his feet. The entire body of skin, complete with all its stab wounds, was in one piece, including the hair, face, ears, nose, mouth, and genitals. Suit dangled from the hook with blood still dripping from it, and its feet dangled on the floor. The autopsy pathologists surmised that the entire process would have taken about 40 minutes, at which time Katherine would certainly have been covered in blood by the time she was finished. Police then proceeded past the skin suit further into the home, where they quickly came across John's corpse laying on the floor, which was both skinless and headless. Katherine had decapitated John's corpse. She left a blood-stained notes he'd written on top of a photo of John. The note groundlessly accused John of raping Katherine's daughter and other indecipherable rantings. While Katherine's monstrous acts up until this point are difficult, the film, it was only the beginning of her depravity. Her next actions were unthinkable. Katherine took John's skinned and decapitated head, placed it in a large pot and boiled it along with vegetables at some point during the morning, since it was still warm when the police arrived later that morning. They go in and there's a meal on the table. For God's sake, there's vegetables, there's gravy, there's his meat, which she's cooked in the oven. You saw it in a horror movie, you'd almost laugh because it's just so over the top. These are the things those coppers saw that day. And these are things that never leave them. She then proceeded to slice off parts of John's buttocks, preparing them as gruesome steaks to be served alongside an elaborate array of baked potato, pumpkin, beetroot, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash, and gravy. She prepared 2 plates along with name cards for each of John's 2 children. She had fully prepared to serve John's body to his children to eat, who fortunately didn't arrive home to discover there was a third meal too, but it was found thrown in the backyard. It is suspected that either Katherine had attempted to eat it but could not, or she had prepared it for the dog. Police proceeded through the home to ultimately find Katherine's loudly snoring, comatose body in bed in a bedroom. Near the end of the home, she had swallowed a large number of pills, which caused her to pass out into a comatose state. She'd later state that it was a suicide attempt. Physicians noted that the dosage wasn't near enough to kill anyone. So a judge later ruled that Katherine had not attempted to take her own life based on analysis of the blood evidence after the initial attack. John had awoken and tried to turn the light on when Katherine began chasing him through the house. He managed to make it outside at some point. Then neither Katherine dragged him back inside, or he stumbled back, and at which point he collapsed and bled to death. She had stabbed him 37 times in the front and back of his body, many of which were deep enough to reach his vital organs. A detective on the scene described what he saw. He's getting up. There's arterial spurting on the robe and the bed and on the doorway. There's a bloodied handprint or swipe on the western side of the door near the dressing table and blood around the light switch. It looks like he's tried to turn the light switch and then all down the hallway. They're everywhere referring to the bloody handprints. And he's almost made it. There's open the front door. Screen door is shut. There is blood staining trajectory again flicking out across the front door. He's almost made it, but he wouldn't have survived. He would have been absolutely horrified, terrified. Probably terrified more than horrified, trying to get out, and all the time being stabbed. Once all the details of the crime came to light, it was revealed that after Katherine killed John, she went into town and made a $1,000 withdrawal from John's account. Then she returned to carry out the unthinkable atrocities police were forced to discover after the horrendous murder of John Price became known. Kathleen's former boyfriend David College recalled how close he came to the same fate as John. He remembered waking up one morning to find Katherine sitting across his chest, grazing his throat with a knife. She laughed and commented how easy it would have been for her to have killed him. He didn't realize at the time how fortunate he was that she hadn't. Talks of charges against Katherine were underway. She attempted to negotiate a plea of manslaughter instead of murder. Her offer to plead guilty to manslaughter was rejected, and she was officially charged with murder on March 2, 2001, to which she pleaded not guilty. Her trial began on October 15, 2001. Before the trial began, the presiding judge offered the 60 jury prospects the option of being excused from the trial due to the extremely graphic nature of the photographic evidence. 5 of the prospects took him up on his offer and were excused. Several more dropped out after hearing the witness list. Then the jury was officially impaneled. However, before court was adjourned that day, the judge was advised that Katherine intended to change her plea from not guilty. The judges swiftly adjourned for the day. The ordered a psychiatric assessment overnight to determine whether Katherine fully understood the consequences of changing her plea to guilty, and that she was psychologically fit to make such a decision. I was somewhat nervous about this because I was concerned that if it took a guilty plea against her, she would then appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeal and says he was insane at the time that she made the plea of guilty. I decided that he should get a court expert to examine her, and the psychiatrist came to exactly the same conclusion as the other psychiatrist that had seen her, namely that she was not insane, as she was quite sane, but she's a bad woman. The following morning, Katherine arrived at their trial, changed her plea to guilty, and the jury was dismissed from their duty as of the making of this video in 2023. Katherine has never given reason for changing her plea to guilty. She has also never accepted responsibility for John's murder or her actions afterward. Came the sentencing hearing in a bold move by the defense. Katherine's lawyers requested that she be allowed to leave the courtroom to avoid hearing some of the particularly gruesome details of the case. Their request was swiftly denied. Then later, as details of the crime scene were being described, Katherine became hysterical and had to ultimately be sedated when it was time to hand down Katherine's sentencing. The judge did not hold back. He pointed out the extreme brutality of the crime and noted Katherine's complete lack of remorse, stating Katherine Mary Knight does not qualify for mercy. She showed him referring to John no mercy. The last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror, or him asked they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. She has not expressed any contrition or remorse, and I for least she poses a serious threat to the security of society. He sentenced Katherine to life imprisonment, refused to set ineligible for parole period, and ordered that her file be marked never to be released, which was a first to happen to any woman imprisoned in Australian history. This was as bad a case as you got, so she had to go to jail for the term of her life. But I can't let out had I found this a very stressful matter. In fact, after it was over, I didn't eat meat for about 3 months. Katherine Knight is currently serving her life sentence at Silverwater Correctional Complex under maximum security, considered Australia's toughest women's prison. It's reported that violence erupts daily and 90% of inmates are drug addicts within those walls. Because of the sheer brutality of the crime she committed, Katherine Knight commands respect from both the inmate population and even prison staff. She doesn't put up with anything from the inmates or the guards. If her cell needs to be searched, she demands that she stay and watch and screams at the guards, who figure it's less of a hassle to just let her stay than to physically restrain her, which is the only alternative when it comes to Katherine and her combative nature. So while she doesn't actually have a record of violence while incarcerated, not even a single incident, she's the boss. And everyone knows it so much so that her nickname used by the guards is officially the boss. As far as Katherine's daily prison life, it starts each morning at 7 a.m. to prepare for her 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. shift making headphones. It's reported to be the most tedious job in the prison, involving a huge and very loud production machines. She's monitored constantly with guards watching her every move. But despite Katherine's notorious reputation and constant monitoring, she's also built both a reputation as well as a physical space inside the prison that is quite contrary to her side within the prison walls. She's known as the Nana for being a mediator to their female inmates, often interceding Beth or conflicts escalated, discouraging thievery, and generally taking on a motherly role. And for her physical space, she's turned her cell into a homey. She's accumulated an enormous amount of trinkets and memorabilia that she's created, crocheted for herself or received from others since she's going to bed for the rest of her life. Fellow inmates noted that she might as well make it feel like home. 5 years after her conviction, Katherine appealed her sentence, claiming that a life sentence without the possibility of parole was too severe for the kill. Their response from the considering judges was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society. Her parole was denied, so as long as her sentence is stayed, Katherine Knight will remain in prison for the remainder of her life, and that's all. Stay tuned for other tragic and mysterious cases. Till then, take care.